I do not remember the moment I was pulled from the sea, only the cold that remained with me when I finally opened my eyes. A deep and persistent chill that seemed to have settled somewhere beneath the skin, as though the waters I had nearly drowned in had not simply tried to claim my life, but had left something of themselves behind, something that lingered even as I lay there on solid ground, staring up at a sky the color of dull iron, while distant voices moved in and out of focus around me. When I found the strength to stand and stepped beyond the small shelter where I had been taken, the island of Bleakrock revealed itself in a quiet that felt almost too complete, the kind of silence that does not come from peace, but from distance, as though the rest of the world had simply forgotten. This place existed, leaving behind only snow-covered paths, scattered wooden homes, and the slow, steady rhythm of a people who had learned to live with little and expect less. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, tools struck against wood somewhere in the distance, and for a brief moment it was easy to believe that nothing truly dangerous could ever reach a place so far removed from the struggles of Tamriel. Yet the longer I remained there, the more that illusion began to fade, replaced by a quiet tension that revealed itself in subtle ways, in the hesitation before someone spoke, in the glances cast toward the horizon, and in the unspoken understanding that something had begun to change. It was Captain Rana who gave shape to that unease, not through panic or fear, but through certainty, the kind that comes not from guesswork, but from experience, as she explained that ships had been sighted and strange activity reported across the island, that people had gone missing, and that whatever was coming would not announce itself with warning enough for them to prepare in comfort. She did not try to reassure me, nor did she pretend that the situation was under control, but instead spoke plainly, telling me that if I had any strength left to give after surviving the sea, then there were others who would need it more in the hours ahead. She sent me out across Bleakrock to find those who had not yet returned, the hunters, scouts, and villagers who still moved about the island unaware that their time there was already running short. And so, I followed the narrow paths that wound through the snow, passing through places that still held the fragile appearance of normal life, while the truth waited just beneath the surface, revealing itself piece by piece with every step I took. At Hozin's Folly, what at first appeared to be nothing more than a bandit encampment soon proved to be something far more deliberate, for the men there were not simply hiding or scavenging, but searching with a purpose that did not belong to them, digging through the remains of an abandoned mine as though they had been sent there with clear instructions. When I spoke with Sergeant Sena, she urged me to uncover the truth by slipping into their ranks, and so I took on the disguise of one of their fallen, moving among them long enough to hear fragments of conversation that spoke not of survival, but of orders, payments, and an artifact hidden deep within the mine that was worth more than anything they might otherwise have stolen. Inside, the truth revealed itself fully, for at the heart of the mine stood a portal, unstable yet active, a tear in the world that led not to any place within Tamriel, but to oblivion itself, sustained by a Daedric relic that pulsed faintly with a power that did not belong in mortal hands. The bandits had been sent to retrieve it, not for themselves, but for a greater force that remained unseen. And when I destroyed the sigil that held the portal open, watching as it collapsed inward and vanished, the silence that followed carried with it a realization that settled heavily into my thoughts, because among the belongings left behind, I found proof that this had not been an isolated act, but part of something larger, something organized. The name appeared clearly: the Daggerfall Covenant. It was not spoken aloud by those I encountered next, but it remained with me as I continued across the island, following the paths that led deeper into its frozen reaches, until at last I came upon Orky's Hollow, where one of the missing villagers had last been seen, and where the air itself seemed to change the moment I stepped inside, becoming sharper, colder, in a way that had nothing to do with the weather outside, as though the cave held onto something that had never fully left. The voice reached me before I fully understood what I was hearing. Faint at first, then clearer, carrying a tone that was not entirely hostile, yet far from welcoming, speaking as though it had been waiting, not for me specifically, but for anyone who might wander into its domain. The figure that emerged from the dimness did not move like the living, nor did it hold the stillness of the dead, but existed somewhere between, shifting at the edges in a way that made it difficult to focus on, as though memory itself could not decide what it was meant to be. He did not give his name at first, instead guiding me through the cave with questions that felt less like challenges and more like fragments of a story he could no longer fully remember, leading me to objects and places that slowly revealed the truth of who he had been. A mage, a spy, someone sent to this remote place for reasons long forgotten, and more importantly, someone who had been abandoned, left to die in the cold with no one to remember him. "Will they remember you?" he asked at one point, his voice quieter now, no longer playful but distant, as though the question was no longer meant for me alone. I could not answer him, because the truth was not something either of us could know, and so I continued until I found the man he had taken, Ayman, still alive but weakened, held within the strange influence that bound the spirit to the cave. When I freed him, something in the air shifted, not violently, but gently, as though a long-held breath had finally been released, and the figure before me began to fade, his form dissolving into nothing as his voice fell to a whisper. "Good," he said. "Then it ends." When I stepped back outside, the wind carried a different kind of silence, one that felt earned rather than empty. But there was no time to dwell on it, because the further I traveled, the more it became clear that whatever had touched Hozin's folly had not been confined to a single place, and that realization followed me to Skyshroud Barrow, where the dead no longer rested. The entrance had been forced open, and inside, the balance of the place had already been broken, skeletons rising from their resting places and spirits lingering where they should have passed on, all driven by the actions of a necromancer who had come seeking power tied to something far older than himself. It was there that I encountered Haldrin, a spirit bound not by confusion or madness, but by purpose, a guardian who had once watched over the barrow and who now sought only to restore what had been disturbed. "You are not the one who woke them," he said, his voice calm despite everything. "Then perhaps you are the one who will set this right." Together, we moved through the barrow, reclaiming the runestones that held the dead in peace, restoring them one by one until we reached the necromancer himself, who had already begun his ritual, his voice rising in desperate incantation as he attempted to bind what should never be controlled. The fight was brief, but decisive, and when it ended, the energy he had summoned collapsed into nothing, leaving only the stillness that should have been there from the beginning. Haldrin remained only long enough to see the balance restored, and as he faded, there was a sense not of loss, but of completion, as though something long delayed had finally been allowed to end. Yet even in that moment, the pattern remained impossible to ignore, because among the necromancer's belongings, I found the same truth once again, the same unseen hand guiding events across the island. The Covenant was already here, and whatever came next would not wait much longer. By the time I made my way back toward the village, the weight of everything I had seen no longer felt like scattered warning, but like a single unavoidable truth that had finally revealed itself in full. And though Bleakrock still stood as it had when I first arrived, with its quiet homes and steady routines, it was now impossible to look upon it without understanding how little time remained before all of it would be lost. Captain Rana did not need a long explanation, nor did she ask for one, because the urgency in my return and the certainty in my voice told her everything she needed to know. And when I spoke the name of the Daggerfall Covenant, she did not react with surprise, but with confirmation, as though the final piece of a puzzle she had already begun to assemble had been placed before her. "There's no more waiting," she said, her voice carrying the calm of someone who has already accepted what must be done, even if others have not yet reached that point. If they're moving in secret, then the fleet won't be far behind, and when it arrives, this island won't stand a chance. We evacuate everyone we can find. There is a different kind of burden in carrying that message than there is in facing an enemy directly, because steel and fire at least give you something clear to fight against, while this required me to walk through a place still holding on to the illusion of safety and tell its people that everything they had built would soon be taken from them, that the land they knew, the homes they had repaired through harsh winters, the paths they had walked since childhood, all of it would have to be abandoned, not because they had failed to defend it, but because there would be no defense strong enough to matter. I moved across Bleakrock once more, but this time the purpose of my journey had changed, and with it, the way the island felt beneath my feet, because every place I visited now carried the quiet knowledge that I might be seeing it for the last time, and every person I spoke to became part of something larger than themselves, a gathering of lives that would soon be uprooted and carried away by necessity rather than choice. Some listened without hesitation, the truth already present in their own fears, needing only to be spoken aloud for them to act, while others resisted, asking questions that could not be answered in any way that would bring them comfort, because there is no gentle way to explain that a home must be left behind without any promise that it will still be there when you return. Yet even those who struggled to accept it could not ignore the urgency that now hung over the island, and one by one they gathered what little they could carry and made their way toward the village. All the while, Bleakrock itself remained unchanged on the surface, as though unaware of what was coming. The same smoke rising from chimneys, the same tools leaning against walls, the same small signs of daily life continuing in quiet defiance of the storm that had already begun to form just beyond the horizon. And it was perhaps that contrast that made everything feel more fragile than it otherwise might have been, because it is one thing to leave a place already broken, and another entirely to leave one that still believes it will endure. When enough of the villagers had been brought together, Captain Rana gave the next order, and there was no hesitation in it, because whatever chance remained now depended on how quickly we could act. The signal beacon had to be lit, not for Bleakrock, which was already beyond saving, but for the mainland, for the cities and strongholds that might still prepare if they knew what was coming. And so I set out toward the tower, aware even before I reached it that the enemy would not have left such a position unguarded. The road that had once been empty now bore the unmistakable presence of Covenant soldiers, their armor catching what little light broke through the grey sky, their movements purposeful and unhurried in a way that made it clear they were no longer hiding. And as I fought my way toward the tower, the final uncertainty fell away, replaced by the undeniable reality that the invasion had already begun. The climb itself felt longer than it should have, each step carrying the weight of what depended on its completion, until at last I reached the beacon and set it alight, watching as the fire rose into the sky with a force that seemed almost defiant, a signal not of resistance, but of warning. A final act meant to carry beyond the island to those who might still be spared what Bleakrock was about to endure. I did not remain there long, because even as the flames took hold, the sound of battle began to carry faintly through the wind, distant at first, then clearer as I descended, until it became impossible to mistake for anything else. And before I had even reached the base of the tower, I knew that whatever time we had hoped to gain had already run out. On the path back, I found Tilrani snowborn lying in the snow, her strength fading quickly, yet her purpose still clear as she spoke, forcing the words through pain that left little room for anything else, telling me that the Covenant had struck the village while I was gone, that those who could flee had gathered near the old tomb by the docks, and that others remained trapped, scattered among the buildings that were already beginning to burn. She did not ask for help, nor did she expect it, and there was a quiet understanding in her voice that whatever remained of her own life would not be carried beyond that moment. There was no time to linger, no space for words that might have brought comfort, and so I left her there, carrying her warning forward into the chaos that awaited. The village was already engulfed when I returned, not in the slow, creeping way of an accidental fire, but in the full force of destruction brought deliberately and without hesitation, flames spreading from one structure to the next as Covenant soldiers moved through the streets with practiced efficiency, cutting down resistance wherever they found it and leaving little behind that could be reclaimed. There is a point in such moments where fear gives way to clarity, not because the danger lessens, but because there is no longer time to consider it. And as I moved through the burning village, pulling survivors from collapsing homes, guiding them through smoke-filled paths toward the tomb, the world narrowed to what could be done in each immediate moment, each life that could still be saved becoming the only thing that mattered. The Earth Turner family had been separated in the chaos, each member trapped in a different corner of the village, and finding them became a task not of strategy, but of persistence, moving from one place to another, breaking through doors, clearing paths, calling out until voices answered, and one by one, bringing them back together before leading them toward the safety of the crypt. Others waited in hiding, uncertain whether it was safer to remain unseen or risk the open paths, and for them, a single voice, a direction, a presence moving with purpose was enough to break that hesitation, to turn fear into motion and motion into survival. By the time I reached the tomb, the remaining villagers had gathered there, pressed together in a space too small for the number of lives it now held, their faces marked by smoke, fear, and the growing realization that Bleakrock, as they had known it, was already gone. Captain Rana stood at the entrance, her focus unwavering, directing the evacuation with a precision that left no room for panic. And when she saw me, there was a brief moment of acknowledgement, not of relief, but of understanding that what could be done above ground had been done, and that now everything depended on the path ahead. We entered the tomb not as explorers, but as those who had no other way forward, moving through ancient halls that had long since been abandoned by the living, yet now served as the only route to survival, the stone walls offering shelter from a world that had turned against us. The path was not without danger, traps still active, passages narrow and unforgiving, yet step by step we moved through them, opening the way for those behind us, ensuring that no one was left trapped between what had been and what might still be. When at last we emerged into the hidden cove beyond, the air felt different, not warmer, but freer, as though the weight of the burning village had been left behind, if only for a moment. And as the refugees boarded the waiting boats, there was no sense of victory, only the quiet understanding that survival had come at the cost of everything they had known. As we pushed away from the shore, I looked back, watching as Bleakrock faded into the distance, its fires still visible against the darkening sky. And though no one spoke, the silence among us carried more than words ever could, because each of us understood that what we left behind would not be waiting for us when we returned. And so we turned toward the mainland, toward Balfoyen, carrying with us not just our lives, but the beginning of a war that had already shown it would take far more before it was done. The journey across the water to the mainland passed in a quiet that felt heavier than any storm I had endured, not because the sea was rough, but because of the silence that settled over those aboard the boats, each person wrapped in their own thoughts, watching the distant glow of Bleakrock's fires fade into darkness, until at last there was nothing left to see but the cold stretch of water behind us and the uncertain shore ahead. When we arrived at Dalmora, there was no welcome waiting, no moment to rest or gather strength after what had been lost, because the reality we had fled from had already begun to take hold here as well, and the sense of urgency that had driven us from the island did not lessen upon reaching land, but instead sharpened into something more immediate, more pressing, as though every step we took forward brought us closer to the heart of a conflict that would not be contained to any single place. Captain Rana did not linger Nor did she allow those under her command to fall into despair, for she understood better than most that survival in one place meant nothing if the same fate awaited in the next. And so she turned her attention immediately to what needed to be done, sending word where she could and placing trust where she had to, before looking to me once more with the same steady certainty that had guided her through the fall of Bleakrock. If the Covenant struck the island first, they won't stop there, she said, her gaze already fixed beyond the settlement, as though she could see the movements of the enemy long before they arrived. Davon's watch needs warning, but the signal tower along the way has to be lit first, or no one will know how close they are. There was no need to say more, because the path had already begun to form before me, stretching across the rugged land of Balfoyan, where ash and stone replaced the snow I had left behind, and where the air itself carried a different kind of weight, one born not of isolation, but of proximity to something larger, something already in motion. I set out along the road toward the watchtower, expecting resistance, but not the silence that greeted me when I arrived, for the place had already fallen, its defenders lying where they had been struck down. Their efforts to hold the line ended before they had been given the chance to sound any alarm. The supplies meant to sustain them had been taken, their positions overrun, and the tower itself stood as a hollow reminder of how quickly preparation can be undone when an enemy strikes with precision. There was no time to dwell on what had happened there, only the necessity of what still needed to be done, and so I gathered what remained, making my way toward the coastal beacons that would carry the warning forward, moving through hidden paths and narrow passages where the enemy presence was lighter yet never absent, because even here, even before the full force of the Covenant had arrived, their influence could already be felt. When I reached the first beacon and set it alight, the flame rose quickly, fed by oil prepared long before this moment, and as it burned, I could not help but think of the signal on Bleakrock, of how that fire had been a warning born from loss, and how this one now served as a continuation of that same desperate attempt to stay ahead of something that moved faster than any of us had hoped. One by one, the beacons were lit, each carrying the message further along the coast, until at last the line of warning was complete, stretching beyond my sight, but not beyond its purpose. And though it would not stop the Covenant, it would at least ensure that those who stood in its path would not face it unprepared. By the time I reached Davon's watch, the city was already stirring with the tension of impending conflict. Soldiers moving with purpose along the walls, preparations underway in every corner, and at the gates I was met by Commander Holgan, whose expression made it clear that the warning had not come too soon. "You're the one from Bleakrock," he said, his voice carrying both recognition and expectation. "We saw the signal. Good work. But if they've already taken the island, then this is where they'll hit next." There was no question in his words, only certainty, and as he spoke, I could see the weight of command resting heavily on him, not because he doubted what needed to be done, but because he understood the cost of doing it. "We're not waiting for them to choose the battlefield," he continued. "We make our stand here, and we make sure they don't get any further." Yet even as the city prepared for siege, it became clear that the defense of Davon's watch would not rely on steel alone, because I was soon directed to speak with a Dunmer noble named Tanval Indaril, whose role in the coming conflict was not immediately obvious, but whose confidence suggested that he held knowledge others did not. He received me without ceremony, his focus already fixed on the task at hand, and when he spoke, it was not of soldiers or fortifications, but of something older, something buried beneath the city itself. There are forces at work here that the Covenant does not fully understand, he said, his tone measured, almost contemplative. And if we are to survive what is coming, we must be willing to use every advantage available to us. He spoke of a relic hidden within the tombs beneath Davon's watch, an object tied to his lineage, and to something far more dangerous than he initially revealed. And though there was something in his words that gave me pause, a sense that the path he was suggesting would not come without consequence, there was no time to question it fully, because the city stood on the edge of battle, and whatever advantage could be gained might mean the difference between holding the line and losing everything. So I went beneath the city, into the tomb where his ancestor rested, the air there still and heavy with the presence of those long gone. And as I reached the chamber where the relic lay, I felt the weight of what I was about to do, not because it was difficult, but because it carried with it a quiet understanding that some actions, once taken, cannot be undone. The spirit that guarded the tomb did not attack, but neither did it welcome me. And when I took the relic, there was no immediate consequence, no sudden release of power, only a lingering sense that something had been set in motion, something that would reveal itself not in that moment, but in the ones that followed. When I returned to the surface, the city had already begun its final preparations, and beyond its walls, the Covenant forces gathered, their presence no longer hidden, their intent clear. And as I stood there, looking out across the land that would soon become a battlefield, I could not help but feel that what we had done beneath the city would play a role in what was to come, though whether it would save us or condemn us remained uncertain. The siege of Davon's Watch had begun, and this time we would not be running. The first signs of the assault did not come as a sudden charge or a thunder of war horns, but as a slow tightening of pressure around the city, as though the Covenant had no intention of rushing what they believed was already within their grasp. And from the walls of Davon's Watch, I could see their forces spreading across the land in careful formation, siege weapons being assembled with practiced efficiency, while smaller units moved along the edges of the cliffs and coastline, searching for weaknesses rather than throwing themselves blindly against the gates. Commander Holgan wasted no time in meeting that approach with one of his own, and rather than waiting for the full force of the siege to fall upon us, he ordered strikes against their preparations, sending me beyond the safety of the walls to disrupt what I could before it could be turned against the city, a task that carried its own risks, but also the understanding that every moment gained now would matter more once the fighting reached its peak. Moving through the outskirts of the battlefield, I found the Covenant already well entrenched, their siege engines positioned with clear lines toward the city walls, guarded by soldiers who showed no hesitation in their purpose. And as I worked to sabotage their efforts, setting fire to their equipment and breaking what I could not carry away, The scale of their advance became impossible to ignore, because this was no probing attack, no test of defenses, but a calculated attempt to break Davon's watch entirely. Yet even as their attention remained fixed on the gates, there were others who had taken a different path, climbing the cliffs that bordered the city, using narrow ledges and hidden routes to bypass the outer defenses altogether. And it was not until the first cries rose from within the city itself that the full extent of their plan became clear. The battle had moved inside. By the time I returned, the streets of Davon's Watch were no longer the ordered lines of preparation I had left behind, but a chaotic clash of steel and fire. Covenant soldiers pouring in from the cliffs, while Pact defenders struggled to hold them back, fighting not for control of the battlefield, but for the survival of the city itself. And in the midst of it all, I made my way back to Tanvil Indoril, because whatever he had set in motion beneath the city had now reached the point where it would either turn the tide or fail entirely. He was already deep within the crypt when I found him. The relic I had retrieved now placed within a ritual circle that pulsed faintly with energy, its light flickering across the stone walls as the sounds of battle echoed from above. And as I took my place beside him, it became clear that there would be no turning back from what he had begun. "You see now why this was necessary," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos beyond the chamber. "Steel alone would not be enough, not against what they bring." There was no time to argue, no space to question the cost, because the Covenant had already begun to push deeper into the city. And as Tanval continued his incantation, the ritual building towards something far greater than the relic itself, I was left to hold the chamber against those who sought to stop it, fighting off wave after wave of enemies who forced their way into the crypt, drawn by the power gathering within. The air grew heavier with each passing moment, the energy within the circle intensifying until it became almost unbearable to stand near it. And then, without warning, the ritual reached its peak, and something answered. The ground trembled. The air split with a sound that did not belong to this world. And from the heart of the ritual, a massive form began to take shape, its presence overwhelming, its heat filling the chamber before it had fully emerged. Balreth, a being of fire and destruction, one of the brothers of strife, called forth not as an ally in the way soldiers might stand beside one another, but as a force to be unleashed upon whatever stood in its path. And as it rose, its form fully realized, the effect on the battle above was immediate. I followed as it moved from the crypt into the open streets, and what I witnessed there was not a battle in the traditional sense, but a collapse of resistance under overwhelming force, as Covenant soldiers who had pushed so confidently into the city were suddenly met with something they had not anticipated, their lines breaking as Balreth tore through them with relentless fury, fire spreading wherever it stepped, turning the tide of the siege in a matter of moments. From the walls, from the streets, from every vantage point within Davon's Watch, the change was unmistakable, because where there had been desperation, there was now something closer to awe, a recognition that the city had been saved, not through defense alone, but through the release of something far more dangerous than the enemy it had driven back. The Covenant forces faltered, then withdrew, their advance broken, their siege abandoned, and for the first time since the attack had begun, there was a pause, a moment in which the immediate threat had passed, and the city still stood. But as I watched Balreth move through the aftermath, its presence lingering, its power unchecked, the realization settled in with quiet certainty, because while the Covenant had been driven away, the force that had done so had not been defeated nor dismissed. It remained, and it did not belong to us. When I turned back toward Tanval, there was no triumph in his expression, only a focused intensity that suggested his work was not yet complete. And though the city had been saved from one destruction, I could not shake the feeling that another had only just begun to take shape, one that would not come from beyond the walls, but from something we had chosen to unleash within them. The siege of Davon's Watch had ended, but the consequences of that victory were only beginning to reveal themselves. The fires that burned across Davon's Watch did not fade quickly, and even after the Covenant forces had withdrawn, the city remained suspended in a strange and uneasy quiet, as though the violence of the battle had not truly ended, but had instead settled into the stone and air, waiting to see what would come next. And among the soldiers and citizens alike, there lingered a shared understanding that the victory they had just witnessed had come at a cost that had not yet been fully revealed. Balreth did not vanish when the fighting stopped, nor did it show any sign of restraint, and though its fury had been turned against the Covenant in that moment, there was no reason to believe it would remain so focused, because it was not a weapon in the way men understand such things, but a force drawn from something far older, something that does not distinguish between ally and enemy once unleashed. And it was this realization that began to spread through the ranks as reports came in from beyond the city walls. The creature had moved toward Ash Mountain. Where it walked, the land itself seemed to respond, the ground cracking, heat rising from beneath the surface, and creatures drawn to its presence gathering in ways that defied natural order. And though the immediate threat to Davon's Watch had passed, it became clear that what we had released would not remain contained by the circumstances of its summoning. Commander Holgan did not attempt to hide his concern, and when he spoke, there was none of the earlier certainty that had carried him through the defense of the city, only the measured resolve of someone who understood that the battle had changed. "We drove the Covenant back," he said, his gaze fixed beyond the walls. "But now we've got something worse to deal with. That thing Tanval brought into this world. It's not going to stop on its own." There was only one course left. Balreth had to be contained or destroyed. And as I set out toward Ash Mountain, the weight of that task settled in fully, because this was no longer a matter of defense or strategy, but of confronting something that should never have been brought into the world in the first place. The land grew harsher with every step, the air thickening with ash and heat, the sky above shifting to a deep, unnatural red as I approached the mountain. And even before I reached the Pact encampment established near its base, I could feel the presence of what awaited beyond, a distant but constant pressure, like the echo of a heartbeat that did not belong to anything living. The soldiers stationed there did not greet me with confidence, nor with the expectation of a simple victory, but with the quiet tension of those who had already seen what we were now meant to face. And among them stood Garin Indoril, Tanval's son, who had taken it upon himself to deal with the consequences of his father's actions. There was something different in his expression, something harder, more focused, as though whatever doubts he might have held had been set aside in favor of a single purpose. "We can't let it spread," he said without preamble, as though the urgency of the situation left no room for anything else. "If Balreth reaches the lava flows at the heart of the mountain, it will grow stronger, strong enough that we may not be able to stop it at all. Yet even with that knowledge, there was a problem that could not be ignored. Balreth had been bound once before, and whatever had been used to contain it then had long since been lost. The answer, as it turned out, lay not within the mountain itself, but in a place of the dead, Othranis, an ancient necropolis where those who had once faced Balreth had been laid to rest, and where the knowledge needed to stop it again might still remain, if it could be reached. The journey there felt removed from the immediate urgency of the mountain, yet no less important, because without understanding how Balreth had been bound before, there would be no way to repeat that success. And as I entered the tomb, the stillness within felt heavier than any battlefield, as though the silence itself carried the weight of those who had failed or succeeded long before my time. The dead did not welcome intrusion, and the path forward was not given freely, but required adherence to rituals that had been preserved across generations, acts of respect that allowed the boundary between the living and the dead to be crossed without violence, and with the guidance of an Argonian named Onuja, I followed those rites, awakening the spirit of one who had once played a role in Balreth's defeat. Mavos Siloreth did not appear as one might expect a hero of the past to appear, nor did he carry himself with the humility of someone long removed from the world of the living, but instead spoke with a sharpness that suggested both intelligence and a certain impatience with the present. "You disturb me for a reason," he said, his form flickering into existence with a faint glow that seemed almost reluctant. "Make it worth my time." When I spoke the name of Balreth, the shift in his demeanor was immediate, though subtle, as though something he had hoped never to hear again had been placed before him. "That creature should never have been summoned again," he said, more quietly now. "But if it has, then you will not stop it without understanding what it is." Through him, I was shown what had once been done, not as a simple explanation, but as a vision of the past, where those who came before had fought not to destroy Balreth, but to bind it, using powerful guardians known as Atronachs, beings capable of containing the very essence of what we now faced. And though the method was complex, the purpose was clear. Balreth could not simply be defeated. It had to be restrained, forced back into a state where its power could no longer spread unchecked. When I returned to Ash Mountain, that knowledge was all that stood between us and failure. And as I began the process of summoning the Atronachs needed to bind Balreth once more, it became clear that even this would not be simple, because the guardians themselves did not answer willingly. each one requiring not only the proper ritual, but the strength to subdue them before they would accept their role. One by one, they came, and one by one, I fought them, until at last, they stood ready, not as allies, but as necessary forces. The final step awaited within the mountain itself, and as I prepared to face Balreth once more, there was no certainty of success, only the understanding that failure was not an option that could be allowed, because what had been unleashed would not stop on its own. The path into the heart of Ash Mountain felt less like entering a place and more like crossing into something already claimed, as though the land itself no longer belonged to the world I had known, but had instead become an extension of the force that now moved within it, shaping everything around it in ways that defied both reason and restraint. And with every step forward, the heat intensified. Not in waves as one might expect near flowing lava, but as a constant, suffocating presence that pressed against the body and made each breath feel heavier than the last. The entrance to the caldera opened before me like a wound, jagged and unstable. The stone cracked and blackened as though it had been forced apart rather than shaped by time. And beyond it, I could see the glow of molten rock casting shifting light across the chamber, illuminating the scale of what we were facing in a way that no description could have prepared me for. Because when I finally stepped inside and saw Balreth fully, not as a distant force or a passing destruction, but as a presence that dominated the space around it, the realization settled in with complete clarity that this was not something meant to be fought in any ordinary sense. Garen Indoril was already there, holding his ground with a determination that bordered on defiance, his movements precise despite the overwhelming environment. And when I reached him, there was no need for words beyond what was necessary, because both of us understood that whatever doubts or fears might have lingered before had no place here, not when the margin for failure had already narrowed to nothing. "Keep it away from the lava," he said, his voice strained but steady, the urgency in it matched by the intensity of the battle already unfolding around him. "If it reaches it, we lose everything." Balreth did not advance in a way that could be anticipated, nor did it follow any pattern that could be learned, but instead moved with a force that seemed guided only by destruction itself. Its strikes sending waves of heat and energy across the chamber, forcing us to adapt with each moment rather than rely on anything resembling strategy. And as we fought to hold its attention, to keep it from reaching the molten flows that would restore its strength, the air filled with more than just fire, as lesser Daedra began to emerge, drawn to the presence of something far greater than themselves. The battle stretched beyond any clear measure of time, each moment defined not by progress, but by endurance, by the ability to remain standing against something that seemed intent on breaking the very space it occupied. And yet slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, we began to push it back, not through strength alone, but through persistence, forcing it away from the sources of power it sought, weakening it with each exchange, until at last there was a shift, subtle but unmistakable, as its movement slowed, its form flickering in a way that suggested not defeat, but vulnerability. That was the moment. The Guardians had to be called, The Atronachs, bound through effort and force, now stood as the only means of containing what we could not destroy. And as I brought them into the chamber, the tension that had defined the battle shifted into something far more precarious, because for a brief instant it seemed as though we had made a grave mistake, as the Guardians did not immediately turn toward Balreth, but instead moved with their own will, their presence as unstable as the force they had been summoned to contain. It was Mavos who intervened, his voice cutting through the chaos with a sharp authority that carried even in death, commanding the Guardians not through force, but through knowledge of what they were meant to be. And slowly, as though remembering something long forgotten, they turned, their focus aligning with the purpose for which they had once been created. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense, but a convergence of forces, as the Atronachs surrounded Balreth, their presence forming a barrier that tightened with each passing moment, not allowing escape, not allowing further expansion, but forcing the creature inward, containing its power in a way that resisted its nature at every turn, until at last the process completed, and the overwhelming presence that had defined the mountain began to recede. The heat did not vanish, nor did the scars left upon the land, but the immediate threat, the relentless force that had moved unchecked since its summoning, was gone, bound once more by the same principles that had held it before. And as the chamber fell into a silence that felt almost unnatural after what had preceded it, there was a moment, brief but undeniable, where it seemed as though the balance had been restored. Garin lowered his weapon, his breath steadying as the tension eased, and though there was no celebration in his expression, there was something close to relief, the kind that comes not from victory, but from the knowledge that disaster has been prevented, even if only for a time. "It's done," he said, more to himself than to me, his gaze fixed on the place where Balreth had been contained. For now. And that was the truth of it. Not an end, not a resolution, but a pause. Because as we left the mountain behind, the ash still falling around us and the land still marked by what had occurred, the understanding remained that what had been unleashed once could be unleashed again, and that the war we had stepped into was not one defined by singular victories, but by the constant struggle to hold back forces that would, given the chance, reshape everything in their path. Stonefalls had been spared from one destruction, but the cost of that survival was only beginning to be understood. The ash had not yet settled when the next call for aid came, and though part of me had hoped, however briefly, that the containment of Balreth might grant the land a moment to recover, that hope faded quickly beneath the reality of what Stonefalls had become, because the war did not pause simply because one threat had been contained, nor did it wait for those who had fought to regain their strength before demanding more of them. The summons led me westward toward the coast near Vivek's Antlers, where the land changed once more, shifting from scorched stone and ash into something far stranger, as towering formations of hardened coral rose from the ground in shapes that seemed almost deliberate, as though they had been placed there by design rather than formed through natural processes, their surfaces catching the light in a way that gave the entire region an otherworldly quality, beautiful at a distance, yet unsettling the closer one came. When I arrived, that uneasy beauty had been broken by the presence of war, as packed forces struggled to hold their ground against a renewed Covenant push. And what I saw there made it immediately clear that this was no ordinary engagement, because the enemy we faced did not stand alone, nor did they fight by conventional means. The ground itself seemed to betray us. Mud shifted where it should have been firm, and from it emerged creatures that did not belong on land, their forms slick and alien as they dragged soldiers down with a strength that defied their size. The Druh, driven from the sea, and now turned into weapons against those who had no defense prepared for them. And as I moved through the battlefield, pulling survivors free where I could and pushing back the Covenant forces that advanced behind these creatures, the pattern began to reveal itself in a way that felt disturbingly familiar. This was not chaos, it was control. Somewhere within the coral structures that dominated the area, something was directing the Drug, bending them to a purpose that aligned too closely with the Covenant's advance to be coincidence. And as I sought out those who might understand what we faced, I was guided to an Argonian known as Sings with Reed, whose connection to the land ran deeper than most. "The coral is not dead," she explained, her voice calm despite the battle that raged around us, as though she spoke of something far older and more important than the conflict before us. "It listens. It remembers. And something has disturbed it." She spoke of the coral heart, a living center within the formations, a source of power that maintained the balance of the region, and more importantly, one that had been tied to something far greater, something I had already encountered once before, though I had not yet fully understood the extent of it. Another brother of strife. The realization came with a quiet certainty that left little room for doubt, because the pattern was too clear to ignore. And as I followed the path toward the heart of the coral, the resistance grew stronger. Covenant forces tightening their hold on the area as though they understood exactly what lay ahead and were prepared to defend it at any cost. Their commander, Alexandra Cornele, had already begun her work. Within the chamber where the coral heart pulsed faintly, its surface fractured and unstable, she stood not as a soldier leading a charge, but as something closer to a scholar of destruction. Her focus fixed on the task before her as she attempted to claim the power within for purposes that did not need to be spoken to be understood. "You're too late," she said as I entered, her voice carrying a confidence that suggested she believed the outcome already decided. "This power will not belong to your pact. It will serve those who know how to use it." The fight that followed was not drawn out, because there was no time for anything beyond what was necessary. And as I pressed forward, forcing her away from the heart before she could complete whatever ritual she had begun, the instability of the chamber itself became more apparent, the energy within the coral reacting to the disruption in a way that threatened to unravel everything at once. It was then that Sings with Reed made her decision. "There is no time to restore it as it was," she said, her gaze fixed on the heart with a clarity that left no room for hesitation. "But it can still be saved." Before I could fully understand what she meant, she stepped forward, placing herself within the flow of energy that pulsed through the chamber. And in that moment, the distinction between her and the coral began to blur. her form merging with the heart in a way that defied anything I had seen before, not as a transformation forced upon her, but as a choice made with full awareness of its cost. The effect was immediate. The unstable energy began to settle, the chaotic pulse of the heart finding a new balance, and with it, the influence that had driven the Druze began to weaken, their movements losing the coordination that had made them so dangerous, until at last they retreated, drawn back toward the water as though released from a command they could no longer hear. Cornelle, deprived of what she sought, made one final attempt to regain control, but without the heart, without the power she had hoped to claim, her efforts faltered, and the battle ended as swiftly as it had begun, leaving the chamber in a fragile stillness that felt earned at a cost that could not be undone. Sings with Reed remained, though not as she had been, her presence now intertwined with the coral itself, her voice quieter, distant in a way that suggested she was no longer entirely part of the world I stood in, yet still aware enough to acknowledge what had been done. "It is enough," she said softly. "The balance holds." There was nothing more to be done there, nothing that could return what had been given, and as I left the chamber, carrying the knowledge of what had been saved and what had been lost, the pattern that had begun with Balrith now stood fully revealed. The Covenant had not simply attacked, they had sought power, the same power we had already been forced to confront. And if they continued, then this would not be the last time such a choice would be demanded. When I returned to Holgan, there was no celebration, only acknowledgement, because in a land where each victory came with a cost that lingered long after the battle ended, there was little room for triumph, only the understanding that what had been prevented today would have to be prevented again tomorrow. And already, the next threat was waiting. The news from the coast had barely settled when the next report arrived, and though part of me had begun to recognize the pattern in the way these crises unfolded, each one rising before the last had fully faded, there was still a sense that what lay ahead would not simply follow the same course, because the nature of the threat had begun to change, shifting from forces that struck from without to something that reached inward, into the structures meant to hold the pact together. The road led north, toward Fort Virac, and even before I reached its walls, the air itself seemed to carry a different weight, one that had little to do with the aftermath of battle, and more to do with something that did not belong among the living, a presence that lingered in the silence between sounds, in the stillness of places that should have been filled with movement and command. The fort had fallen, not in the chaotic collapse I had seen elsewhere, but in a way that felt controlled, deliberate, as though its capture had been only the first step in something more calculated. And as I approached, the signs of conflict were present, bodies where they had fallen, defenses broken or turned inward. Yet there was something else as well, something that made the scene feel incomplete, as though the story of what had happened there had not ended with the deaths of those who had tried to defend it. It became clear why, as soon as I crossed the threshold, the dead were not still. They moved through the fort with a purpose that did not belong to them, rising not as remnants of battle, but as extensions of a will that had claimed them even in death. Their movements coordinated, their presence a continuation of the conflict rather than its aftermath. And in that moment, the nature of the threat revealed itself fully. Necromancy, not as an isolated act, not as the work of a single desperate individual, but as a tool being used to hold the fort, to turn what should have been a victory for the Covenant into something far more difficult to reclaim, because an enemy that does not remain dead cannot be defeated in the same way as one that does. To enter the fort openly would have meant fighting not just the living forces that remained, but the endless cycle of the fallen rising again. And so the path forward required something different, something that lay beneath the surface rather than above it, leading me into the catacombs that ran beneath the structure, where the boundary between life and death had already begun to thin. There, the world shifted in a way that was difficult to fully describe, as though each step carried me further from the solidity of the present and closer to something less certain, a place where the dead lingered not only as bodies, but as echoes, their presence felt in ways that did not rely on sight alone. And as I moved through those shadowed passages, guided by the faint traces of what had been disturbed, the understanding grew that this was no simple occupation. The fort was being held by design. The necromancer responsible, a Covenant general named Sarian, had chosen this place not only for its strategic value, but for what it could become under his control, a stronghold that would not fall easily because it would not truly lose its defenders. And as I worked my way upward, opening hidden paths, disrupting what I could of the magic that sustained his hold, the path to the surface began to take shape. When I reached the mechanism that would open the gates, there was a brief pause, a moment in which the weight of what followed settled into place, because once those gates were opened, there would be no quiet approach, no subtle movement, only the full force of the pact pushing in to reclaim what had been lost. I pulled the lever, the gates opened, and the battle began. Pact forces surged into the fort with the momentum of those who had waited too long to strike, meeting the resistance within not with hesitation, but with the certainty that reclaiming this place was not optional. And as I moved through the conflict, pushing toward the center where Sarian held his control, the clash between life and death became impossible to separate, because the same soldiers we struck down rose again moments later, their forms twisted by the magic that bound them. It was not a battle that could be won through attrition. It had to be ended at its source. When I reached Sarian, he did not retreat, nor did he attempt to delay, but instead faced the inevitable with the calm of someone who believed his work had already achieved its purpose, his control over the dead evident in the way they moved around him, responding not to instinct, but to command. "You fight for something that will fall all the same," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding him. "This war is not won by holding ground. It is won by breaking what stands upon it." There was no answer to give him, not one that mattered in that moment, and so the confrontation ended as it had to, in direct conflict, his strength drawn not only from his own skill, but from the power he wielded over those who had already fallen. Yet even that was not enough to hold against what we had brought to bear. In the end, he fell. The control he held over the dead broke with him, the unnatural movement within the fort slowing, then stopping, as the magic that sustained it unraveled, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the battle itself. For a brief moment, it seemed as though that would be the end of it. But war rarely allows such clean conclusions. As Cirion lay dying, he spoke one final incantation, not in desperation, but with a deliberate focus that suggested this had always been part of his plan. And before I could react, the magic he released struck its target. Garin Indoril. He fell without a word. The weight of that moment did not fully settle until Tanvol arrived, his presence cutting through the aftermath of the battle with a force that had nothing to do with magic or command. And as he saw what had been done, as he understood what had been taken from him, something in him shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. Grief does not always show itself in the same way. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it breaks outward. In Tanvol, it became something else entirely. Holgun spoke to him, trying to reach him, to pull him back from whatever path he was beginning to step onto. But the words did not find their mark, because whatever Tanvol had been before that moment had already begun to give way to something driven not by reason, but by loss. He took the coral heart, and he left. There was no attempt to hide his intent, no effort to mask what he had chosen, because in his mind, there was no longer a question of whether such power should be used, only whether it could bring about the end he now sought. As he disappeared from the fort, the truth settled in with a clarity that felt colder than anything I had faced before. The danger was no longer only beyond the pact. It had begun to rise from within it, and whatever came next would not be as simple as facing an enemy across a battlefield. The aftermath of Fort Virac did not bring relief, only a deeper and more troubling silence, the kind that settles when something irreversible has taken place, and those who remain are left to face not only what has been lost, but what may yet come from it. And as the fort was secured, and the last remnants of Cirion's influence faded into stillness, the absence that Garin left behind seemed to weigh more heavily than the victory itself, because it was not simply a life that had been taken, but a turning point, one that had shifted the course of everything that followed. Tanval's departure did not go unnoticed, nor was it misunderstood, for there was no ambiguity in the way he had taken the coral heart, no attempt to conceal his intent or delay his actions. And as word spread of what had happened, the urgency that had once been directed outward toward the Covenant now turned inward, toward the path he had chosen, and the consequences that would follow if he were not stopped. Holgun did not waste time in giving the order, and when he spoke, there was a weight in his voice that had not been there before, a recognition that this was no longer a matter of strategy or defense, but of preventing something far more dangerous from unfolding. "He's going to use it," he said, his gaze fixed in the direction Tanval had gone, as though he could still see the trail left behind. "Not to protect us, not anymore. But to end this war, the only way he thinks matters now, if he reaches another source of power, if he awakens what's buried out there, we won't be able to control it. There was only one place such an act would lead: Kraganmore. The journey there felt different from those that had come before, not because the land itself had changed, but because the purpose of the path had shifted, and where once I had moved to defend, to warn, or to contain threats that came from beyond the pact, I now moved to prevent one of our own from bringing about a destruction that no enemy had yet managed to achieve. When I arrived, the city did not immediately reflect the danger that loomed over it, yet beneath its surface, the signs were already there, subtle but unmistakable in the tension that ran through its streets, in the guarded looks of those who spoke only in half answers, and in the presence of the vanguard, a faction that held influence not through open authority, but through control, their reach extending into places it should not have, their presence felt in decisions that did not belong to them. It became clear quickly that Kraganmore was already under strain, not from an external siege, but from within. And as I sought out the source of that instability, the truth revealed itself in pieces that fit together too precisely to be coincidence, because the ruling house had been compromised, its authority weakened by the abduction of its heir, and the vanguard had used that absence to shape the city's actions, ensuring that no resistance would rise against what was already being set in motion. Tanval had passed through here, and he had not come quietly. The search for the hostage led me into the hidden spaces beneath the city, where those loyal to the vanguard had concealed their hold over Kraganmore's leadership. And as I fought my way through those who stood in defense of that control, it became clear that their loyalty was not to the city, nor even to the pact, but to something that aligned more closely with the path Tanval had chosen, a willingness to see destruction used as a means of resolution, regardless of what it might cost. When I freed the hostage, breaking the hold that had kept the city in silence, there was a brief moment in which it seemed as though the situation might yet be contained, as though the removal of that pressure would allow Kraganmore to reclaim itself before anything worse could take hold. But that moment passed quickly, because Tanval had not remained. He had already moved on, and his destination was no longer a matter of speculation. The Tormented Spire, an ancient place, one whose history was tied to forces that had been buried for a reason. And as I made my way there, the air itself seemed to grow heavier, not with ash or heat as it had at Ash Mountain, but with something more oppressive, as though the land remembered what had once been sealed there and resisted the thought of it being disturbed again. By the time I reached the spire, the ritual had already begun. The structure pulsed with energy that did not remain contained within its walls, but bled outward into the surrounding land, twisting the space around it in subtle but unmistakable ways. And as I fought my way inside, the resistance I encountered was not simply that of soldiers or defenders, but of something that had already begun to take hold of the place itself. The ascent was not easy, each level of the spire presenting its own obstacles, its own resistance, yet the path forward remained clear, driven not by certainty of success, but by the knowledge that whatever awaited at the top could not be allowed to reach completion. When I reached the final chamber, Tanval stood there, the coral heart in his grasp, the ritual already nearing its end. And for a moment, there was a stillness that seemed almost out of place, given everything that had led to that point, as though the weight of what was about to happen had forced even the chaos around us to pause. He looked at me, and in that moment, I could still see the man he had been, not yet fully consumed by what he had chosen, but standing on the edge of something that would leave no part of him unchanged. "They took everything," he said, his voice not raised, but steady in a way that made it clear he believed every word. "And you would have me answer that with restraint, with patience? No. This ends now." There was no argument that would reach him, no words that could undo what had already taken hold, and before I could move to stop him, the ritual completed. The spire shook, the air fractured, and from within the power he had unleashed, something began to emerge. Sadal, another brother of strife. The force that followed was immediate and overwhelming, not building slowly, but erupting into existence with a presence that demanded acknowledgement, its form towering within the chamber, its energy filling the space in a way that left no doubt as to what had just been released. The battle that followed was not one of strategy or planning, but of necessity, of facing what had been brought into the world and forcing it back before it could spread beyond the spire. And as I fought, drawing upon everything that had brought me to that moment, the pattern repeated itself once more, not in the details, but in the truth behind it. This was not the first time such a force had been unleashed, and it would not be the last. Yet as Sadal faltered, as its strength began to break under the combined effort to contain it, the focus shifted once more, because when it fell, the power that had sustained it collapsed, and with it, the purpose that had driven Tanval forward. He stood there, no longer empowered, no longer driven by the same force that had carried him to that point, but left with the reality of what had been done. And in that moment, there was no defiance, no attempt to continue what had already failed, only the quiet aftermath of a choice that could not be undone. The spire grew still, the ritual ended, and with it, the immediate danger passed. But as I stood there, looking out across the land that had once again been spared from destruction, the understanding remained that what had been prevented here was not an isolated event, but part of something far larger, something that reached beyond Stonefalls, beyond the Pact, and into the very fabric of the war that now spread across Tamriel. Because if such power could be sought, used, and nearly unleashed more than once, then it would be sought again. And next time, there might not be anyone left to stop it. When I left the tormented spire, the air outside felt strangely still, as though the land itself had withdrawn from what had taken place within its walls, unwilling to acknowledge how close it had come to being consumed by something it had once buried deep enough to be forgotten. And for a time, as I made my way back toward the Pact encampment, there was no immediate call to action, No urgent summons to the next battlefield, only the quiet aftermath of what had already been endured. Stonefalls had held. The Covenant had been pushed back. Balreth had been contained, the Coral Heart preserved, Fort Virac reclaimed, and Sadal forced back into silence. And yet, none of it felt like victory. There are moments in war where the absence of conflict does not bring peace, but instead reveals how fragile everything has become. And as I returned to Commander Holgan, I saw that same understanding reflected in him, not as doubt, but as a recognition that what we had faced here was only a part of something far greater, something that would not be ended by holding a single region, no matter how fiercely it was defended. "You did what needed to be done," he said, his voice steady, though not without weight. "Stonefalls still stands because of it. But don't mistake that for the end of anything. Not out here. Not now." He spoke of the wider war, of the shifting fronts and the growing pressure on all sides. But more than that, he spoke of the internal strain that had begun to show itself in ways that could not be ignored, because what had happened with Tanvil was not simply the tragedy of one man's fall, but a warning, a sign that the pact itself was not immune to the same forces that threatened it from beyond. "We're holding," he continued, his gaze moving across the land as though measuring the strength of something unseen. "But we're being tested, every part of us, and the next place you're going, it's not going to be any easier." The road led south, to Deshaan. If Stonefalls had been defined by fire and open conflict, then Deshaan carried a different kind of threat, one that did not announce itself with armies or siege engines, but spread quietly, beneath notice, until it was already too late to ignore. The land itself reflected that difference, as the harsh terrain of ash and rock gave way to fertile plains and marshlands, where life grew in abundance and settlements stood larger, more established, with the great city of Mournhold at its heart, a place that should have represented stability, order, and the enduring strength of the Dunmer. Yet even before I reached its walls, the signs were there, not of battle, but of sickness. Travelers spoke in lowered voices, their words carrying unease rather than fear, describing villages where people had fallen ill without warning, where families had been struck down in a matter of days, and where the cause of it all remained unclear, not because it was hidden, but because it did not follow any pattern that could be easily understood. When I entered Mournhold, the atmosphere confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, because while the city itself remained intact, its streets active, its guards vigilant, there was an undercurrent to everything, a tension that ran beneath the surface of daily life, as though something unseen had taken root and was spreading outward, touching everything without ever fully revealing itself. This was not the kind of threat that could be faced with a blade. It was not an enemy that could be driven back by force. It was something quieter, and because of that, something far more dangerous. The investigation began at the edges, in the smaller settlements where the sickness had first been reported, and as I moved through those places, speaking with those who remained, examining what had been left behind, it became clear that this was no natural affliction. because the symptoms did not follow any known illness, nor did they spread in a way that suggested chance. There was intent behind it, direction, and as I followed that trail, moving from one afflicted area to another, the pattern began to emerge, subtle at first, then undeniable, because wherever the sickness had taken hold, there were signs that something had been placed there beforehand. Alchemical traces, disturbed supplies, and in some cases, the remains of rituals that had nothing to do with healing. This had been created, and more importantly, it was being controlled. The name came slowly, spoken by those who had only fragments of understanding, yet consistent enough to form a single thread that led deeper into the truth. The Maulborn, a group that did not operate openly, that did not claim territory or announce its presence, but instead worked through manipulation, through influence, and now, through something far more insidious, using disease not as a consequence of war, but as a weapon within it. Their goal was not immediate destruction, it was destabilization, weakening the region from within, turning fear into division. And as I continued to uncover the extent of their reach, it became clear that this was not limited to Deshaan alone, but was part of a broader effort, one that aligned too closely with the patterns I had already begun to see elsewhere. The pact was not only being attacked from without, it was being eroded from within, and if Deshaan fell into chaos, then the strength that held the alliance together might begin to fracture in ways that no army could repair. The deeper I went, the clearer the truth became, because the Maulborn were not acting randomly, nor were they improvising, but following a plan that had been set in motion long before I arrived. And at its center was a figure whose influence extended beyond the reach of any single region, a name that had begun to surface alongside theirs, one that carried with it the weight of something far older than the conflict we now faced. And as I prepared to confront what lay at the heart of their operation, I understood that this would not be a battle fought in open fields or burning cities, but in hidden places, against enemies who did not rely on strength alone, but on patience, precision, and the ability to strike where they would not be seen until it was too late. Deshaan did not burn, it did not fall to siege, but what threatened it had the power to do something far worse, to break it from within. And this time, there would be no signal fire to warn what was coming. The deeper I moved into Deshaan, the more the nature of the threat revealed itself not through open confrontation, but through absence, through the quiet spaces where something should have been present and was not, through homes left untouched yet empty, through fields that had been tended only days before, now abandoned without explanation, and through the uneasy silence that settled over places where life had once carried on without interruption. In one such village, I found those who remained gathered near a small shrine, their voices low, their expressions marked not only by fear, but by confusion, as though they had witnessed something they could not fully understand. And when I asked what had happened, their answers came in fragments, each one incomplete on its own, but together forming a picture that grew clearer with each telling. They fell sick overnight, one said, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. Not like any illness I've seen. It came too fast, and when it took them, it didn't end there. Another spoke, quieter still. Some of them got back up, but it wasn't them anymore. The pattern was unmistakable now. This was not simply disease. It was transformation. And whatever the Maulborn had unleashed, it was designed not only to weaken the living, but to turn them into something that could be used against those who remained. A method as effective as it was cruel, because it did not rely on armies or siege, but on the very people it consumed. Following the trail led me to places hidden from ordinary sight, small enclaves and concealed laboratories where the work behind the plague had been carried out, and in each of them, I found the same signs: alchemical equipment left behind in haste, notes detailing symptoms and progression, and most telling of all, the presence of individuals who had not fled, but remained to oversee the spread of their creation, guarding it not as something dangerous, but as something valuable. They did not fight like soldiers. They resisted like caretakers. And in doing so, they revealed the depth of their purpose. This was not destruction for its own sake. It was control. Each site I uncovered brought me closer to the center of their operation, and as I dismantled what I could, destroying their supplies, freeing those they had taken, and putting an end to those who could not be reasoned with, the resistance grew stronger, more organized, as though the Maulborn had begun to recognize that their work was being undone and had chosen to respond in kind. It was in one of their deeper holdings that I found the first clear indication of the scale of what they had planned, a chamber larger than the others, more heavily guarded, where the air itself carried a thickness that spoke not only of illness, but of something darker, something tied to forces beyond simple alchemy. And there, among the remnants of their experiments, I found writings that spoke of more than plague. They spoke of purpose, of weakening the pact, not through direct conflict, but by turning its strength against itself, by spreading fear, mistrust, and instability until the alliance could no longer hold. And beneath those plans, beneath the careful structure of their intent, there was another name, one that did not belong to the Maulborn alone, a name I had heard before, the Worm Cult. The connection was not fully clear, not yet, but it was enough to understand that what I faced here was not isolated, not confined to Deshaan, but part of a larger movement, one that reached across regions, linking events that at first had seemed separate into a single, deliberate progression. The deeper I followed that path, the closer I came to its source, until at last I reached the stronghold where their leader operated, a place hidden well enough to avoid casual discovery, yet central enough to coordinate everything that had been set in motion. And as I entered, the resistance I encountered was no longer scattered or reactive, but focused, determined, as though the Maulborn understood that this was where their work would either endure or end. At the heart of it, I found the one responsible. Their leader did not greet me with surprise, nor with hostility born of desperation, but with a calm that suggested this moment had always been expected, as though my arrival was not a disruption, but a step within a larger plan. "You see the effects," they said, their voice measured, almost reflective. "You understand what has been done here, but you still do not understand why." There was no need to answer, because the truth of their intent had already been revealed, and as the confrontation began, it was clear that this was not simply a battle of strength, but of opposing purposes, one seeking to preserve what remained, the other to reshape it entirely. The fight was decisive. There was no room for delay, no opportunity for retreat, and when it ended, the hold they had over Deshaan began to unravel, the systems they had put in place collapsing as their leader fell, leaving behind not resolution, but the beginning of recovery, a process that would take time, effort, and more than a little trust to rebuild what had been broken. The plague did not vanish, but it stopped spreading, and that was enough. When I returned to Mournhold, the city stood as it had before, yet the atmosphere had shifted, not because the threat had been removed entirely, but because it had been faced, uncovered, and contained, and in doing so, had revealed something that could no longer be ignored. The Pact was vulnerable, not only to armies, not only to Daedric forces, but to those who understood how to weaken it without ever standing openly against it. As I stood within the city, looking out across the lands of Deshaan, I understood that what had been fought here would not be the last of its kind, and that the war we were part of was not defined solely by the battles we could see, but by the ones that unfolded quietly beneath the surface, where the greatest damage could be done before anyone realized it had begun. And as I prepared to move on toward the next region that called for aid, the thought remained with me, steady and unyielding. If the Pact was to endure, it would have to face not only its enemies, but itself. The road that led me out of Deshaan carried none of the weight of fire or ash that had marked my journey through Stonefalls, nor the suffocating presence of sickness that had settled over the marshlands and villages I had just left behind. And yet, as I moved southward, there was no sense of relief in leaving it, only the quiet understanding that whatever I had uncovered there had not ended, but had instead revealed something far larger, something that extended beyond any single region, threading its way through the Pact in ways that were only just beginning to be seen. When the land began to change again, giving way to the dense wetlands of Shadowfen, the shift was immediate and unmistakable, not only in the environment, but in the way the world seemed to breathe differently there, as though the very ground beneath my feet was alive in a way that resisted easy understanding, water pooling in places where solid earth might have been expected, roots twisting through the marsh like living structures, and the air thick with heat and moisture that clung to everything it touched. This was Argonian land. And unlike the uneasy tension of Deshaan, where danger had hidden itself beneath the surface, here the unease was present from the very beginning, not as something concealed, but as something carried openly in the way the Argonians regarded those who passed through their territory. their expressions measured, their movements deliberate, as though every interaction was weighed against a history that had not been forgotten. The Pact had brought them together with the Dunmer and the Nords, but unity does not erase memory, and as I travelled deeper into Shadowfen, that truth became increasingly clear, not through conflict, but through distance, through the quiet separation that existed even in places where cooperation should have been strongest. Reports of trouble had drawn me there, though unlike the structured patterns I had followed in Deshaan, these were scattered, uncertain, describing disappearances, strange rituals, and entire settlements that had gone silent without explanation. And at first, it was tempting to believe that this was simply another extension of the Malborn's influence, another thread of the same pattern I had already begun to unravel. But as I followed those reports, moving from one isolated area to another, the nature of what I encountered began to diverge in ways that could not be ignored. This was something else. The signs were there in the details, in the structures that had been raised not for habitation, but for purpose. Crude altars, formed from bone and wood, marked with symbols that did not belong to Argonian tradition, their placement deliberate, their design tied to something far older and far more dangerous than the political machinations I had faced before. And then there were the people, or what remained of them. Those who had not vanished entirely had been changed, their behavior altered, their eyes carrying a distant focus that suggested their thoughts were no longer entirely their own. And when they spoke, their voices carried fragments of something that did not originate from within them, as though they were repeating words that had been placed there by another. The deeper I went, the more those fragments aligned, forming a pattern that I could no longer mistake because I had seen it before, in different forms, across different lands, yet always tied to the same source. Molag Bal. The influence of the Planimeld had reached here as well, but in Shadowfen, it had not taken the form of open invasion or structured cult activity, but something more insidious, something that worked through the people themselves, twisting their beliefs, their traditions, until what had once been sacred became something else entirely. This was not just corruption, it was manipulation. The Argonians had long held their own ways, their own understanding of the world, deeply tied to the hist and the rhythms of the land. And what I began to uncover was a deliberate attempt to exploit that connection, to turn it into something that could be used, reshaped, and ultimately broken. Some followed willingly, others did not. But in both cases, the result was the same: division. And as I worked alongside those who resisted, those who still held to the pact despite the weight of their past, the truth became impossible to ignore, because what was happening here was not simply about power or even about destruction. It was about turning one part of the pact against itself. The trail led me deeper into the swamp than I had intended to go, into places where the water grew still and the air seemed to thicken, where the presence of what I had been tracking became stronger, more concentrated, until at last I reached a site where the corruption was no longer subtle but fully realized, its influence shaping everything within its reach. There, At the center of it, I found the source. Not a single individual, not a leader in the way I had encountered before, but a convergence of influence, a focal point through which the will of something greater was being expressed. Its purpose clear, even if its full nature remained beyond what could be easily understood. It sought to claim Shadowfen, not through force, but through transformation. The battles that followed were unlike those I had faced elsewhere, not because they lacked intensity, but because of what they represented. Each confrontation not just a struggle against an enemy, but against what those enemies had once been. Argonians who had been drawn into something they could no longer escape, their actions no longer their own. It was not a fight that could be approached lightly, nor one that could be avoided. And so I did what had to be done, breaking the altars, disrupting the rituals, severing the connections that allowed the influence to spread, until at last the hold began to weaken, not vanish, but falter. The source, whatever form it had taken, could not sustain itself without those connections. And as they fell, one by one, the presence that had defined the area began to recede, its grip loosening, its reach diminishing until it no longer dominated the land as it had before. When it was over, the swamp did not change in any visible way. The water still pooled where it had, the trees still rose in their tangled forms, and the air remained thick and heavy as ever. Yet something had shifted, something subtle but real, as though a pressure that had once been constant had been lifted, leaving behind only the memory of what had been there. The pact held, barely, and as I prepared to leave Shadowfen behind, moving north once more toward colder lands, the understanding remained with me, clearer now than it had ever been. Every region, every people, every alliance was being tested, and the deeper I traveled, the more it became clear. This was not coincidence. It was design, and somewhere beyond what I could see, something was guiding it all. The road north from Shadowfen carried me away from the heavy air of the marsh and into a land where the cold returned with a clarity that felt almost cleansing at first, the sharp wind cutting through the lingering weight of everything I had seen. Yet even that brief sense of clarity did not last, because by now I had come to understand that no region within the pact stood untouched, and whatever waited ahead would not be any less complex simply because it revealed itself more openly. When the towers of Windhelm came into view, rising stark and unyielding against the pale sky of Eastmarch, there was no mistaking the strength of the place, its stone walls weathered by time and conflict, its presence a reminder that the Nords had endured hardships long before the pact had ever been formed. And yet, as I passed through its gates, the atmosphere within did not match the image it projected from afar, because beneath the order and structure there was tension, not hidden as it had been in Deshaan, nor subtle as it had been in Shadowfen, but present in the open, carried in the way people spoke, in the way they watched one another, in the way certain conversations ended before they could fully begin. At the center of it all stood Joran the Skald King, a figure whose reputation had reached even beyond the lands of the pact, a leader who had chosen unity, where others might have chosen isolation. Yet even his presence did not fully resolve the divisions that ran through his people, because the Nords were not easily swayed by alliances that required compromise, and while many stood with him, there were those who questioned whether the pact truly served their interests, or whether it had drawn them into conflicts that were not their own. That division alone would have been enough to create instability. Yet as I began to follow the reports that had brought me there, it became clear that something else had taken root within Eastmarch. Something that did not simply exploit the tension, but sought to deepen it, to push it beyond disagreement into something far more dangerous. The first signs appeared in the outskirts, in the ancient sites scattered across the land, places tied to the history of the Nords, where the past was not only remembered, but preserved, and where the boundary between what had been and what remained could still be felt. And it was there that I found the disturbances, graves opened, barrows breached, and within them, the unmistakable presence of something that had no respect for the sanctity of the dead. The Worm Cult. Their presence here did not announce itself loudly, nor did it follow the same patterns I had seen elsewhere, because in Eastmarch, they had chosen their targets with care, focusing not on settlements or supply lines, but on the symbols of Nord identity, the places that carried meaning beyond their physical structure. And by disturbing them, by twisting what they represented, they were not simply raising the dead, but striking at something deeper. This was not just necromancy, it was desecration. As I worked alongside those who remained loyal to the Skald King, disrupting the cult's activities where I could, the scope of their plan began to reveal itself in fragments that gradually formed a single unsettling truth, because the sites they targeted were not chosen at random, but aligned with something greater, something that lay beneath the land itself. They were searching, not for relics, but for power, ancient power, tied to the very foundations of Eastmarch, something that had been buried long ago, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been deemed too dangerous to remain in the world above. And as I followed their movements, moving from one disturbed site to another, the pattern led me closer to the center of their efforts. The resistance grew stronger the deeper I went, the cult no longer operating in scattered groups, but in coordinated forces that suggested their objective was near. And when I finally reached the place where their work had begun to take its final shape, the air itself felt different. Not with heat or corruption as I had felt before, but with something older, colder, as though the land remembered what had been placed there and resisted its return. The ritual had already begun. Dark energy moved through the ground in subtle waves, barely visible, yet impossible to ignore once recognized. And at the center of it all, the cultists worked with a focus that suggested they understood exactly what they were attempting, even if they did not fully comprehend the consequences. The power they sought was not Daedric, not in origin, but that did not make it any less dangerous. If anything, it made it worse, because this was something that belonged to the Nords themselves, something tied to their history in a way that made its misuse all the more destructive, not only in what it would do to the land, but in what it would mean for those who called it home. I did not hesitate. There was no time to observe, no space to consider alternatives, because whatever they were attempting had already reached a point where delay would only strengthen it. And as I moved to disrupt the ritual, the response was immediate. The cultists turning their attention toward me with a determination that left no doubt as to how close they were to success. The fight that followed was intense, but not prolonged, because the structure of the ritual itself became its weakness once it was broken, the energy that had been carefully directed unraveling as its focus was disrupted, turning against those who had attempted to control it. And in that collapse, the power they had sought began to recede, drawn back into whatever depth it had once been held within. The ground stilled, the air cleared, and the presence that had begun to rise faded once more into silence. The cult was broken. For now, when I returned to Windhelm, the city still stood as it had before, strong, unyielding, yet the tension within it had not vanished, because the events I had uncovered had only confirmed what many had already feared, that the threats facing the Pact were not only external, but internal, and that unity, once formed, must be continually maintained, not assumed. Joran remained resolute, his belief in the Pact unchanged, yet even he could not deny what had been revealed. And as I stood within the city, looking out across the frozen expanse of Eastmarch, I understood that what had been prevented there was only one part of a much larger conflict, because beyond Eastmarch lay the final region of the Pact, the Rift, and whatever waited there would not be any less significant than what had come before. The journey was not yet over, but it was nearing its end, and as I prepared to take that final step, I could not help but feel that everything I had faced so far had been leading toward it. The road into the Rift felt at first like a return to something steadier, something more grounded than the shifting dangers I had faced in the lands behind me, because the forests there were dense but not oppressive, the mountains high but not hostile, and the settlements that dotted the region carried a sense of endurance that had not yet been broken, as though the people of this land had learned not only to survive hardship, but to expect it, and in doing so, had built something that could withstand more than most. Yet that impression did not last, because by the time I reached Riften, it had already begun to unravel. The city stood as it always had, its wooden structures rising along the water's edge, its docks alive with movement, and its walls standing firm against the wilderness beyond. But beneath that familiar appearance, there was a tension that ran deeper than anything I had encountered in Eastmarch, not because it was louder or more visible, but because it had taken root within the very systems meant to hold the city together. Crime was not new to Riften, but this was different. This was control. The Thieves' Guild had always operated in the shadows, their influence felt but rarely seen. Yet now their reach had grown beyond quiet dealings and hidden exchanges, extending into the governance of the city itself, shaping decisions, controlling movement, and turning what should have been a place of law into something that existed between order and chaos. At the center of it stood Narcis Dren, a figure whose ambition had begun to stretch far beyond the bounds of simple influence, his actions guided not by loyalty to the Pact, nor by any sense of responsibility to those who lived under his reach, but by a desire for power that had found fertile ground in a city already accustomed to operating outside the rules that governed others. Yet even that was not the true source of the danger. It was merely the surface. Because as I began to follow the threads that wove through Riften, it became clear that what I had uncovered in Deshaan and Eastmarch had not ended there, but had instead continued, evolving, connecting, until at last the pattern that had been forming across the pact came into focus. The worm cult was here, not openly, not in force, but in influence. Their presence was subtle, hidden within the chaos of the city, using its disorder as cover for something far more deliberate, something that aligned too closely with the events I had already witnessed to be coincidence. They were not simply present, they were working towards something. And whatever that was, it would not be confined to Riften alone. The investigation led me beyond the city, into the forests and ruins that surrounded it, places where the land itself seemed to carry the echoes of older times, where ancient structures stood partially reclaimed by nature, yet still held the weight of what they had once been. And it was there that the signs became clearer. Rituals carried out in hidden clearings, relics taken from places that should have been left undisturbed, and always the same underlying purpose: preparation for something larger. The final thread led me to a place known as Fallowstone Hall, an ancient Nord burial site that had long been sealed, its purpose preserved through generations as a place of rest for those who had earned it. And as I approached, the air carried a familiarity I had come to recognize, the same unnatural stillness that marked places where the dead had been disturbed. The worm cult had reached it first. Inside, the dead had already been raised, their presence filling the halls not as guardians, but as tools. And as I fought my way through them, the realization settled in fully, because this was not an isolated act, not a simple desecration, but part of something that had been building across every region I had passed through. The cult was gathering power, not in a single place, but across many. And now, it was being brought together. At the heart of the hall, I found the one overseeing it, their actions deliberate, their purpose clear. And when I confronted them, there was no denial, no attempt to conceal what had been done, because by that point, there was no longer any need. "You've seen the pattern," they said, their voice carrying a certainty that suggested they believed the outcome already decided. "You followed it from one end of the pact to the other, and still, you think you can stop it here." It was not arrogance, it was conviction, and that made it more dangerous. The battle that followed was not unlike those that had come before, yet it carried a different weight, because this was no longer about a single threat, a single region, or even a single faction, but about something that had been building across all of them, something that had drawn together the strands of every conflict I had faced into a single point. When it ended, the immediate danger was stopped, the ritual broken, the dead returned to stillness once more. Yet even as the silence settled over Fallowstone Hall, the understanding remained that this had not been the culmination of what the worm cult sought to achieve, but merely a step within it. When I returned to Riften, the city remained as it had been, its problems unresolved, its structures still strained. Yet beneath all of that, there was a shift, subtle but present, as though something that had been pressing inward had been pushed back, if only slightly. The pact still stood, from Bleakrock to the Rift, from ash to marsh to snow and forest. It had been tested in ways that few could have anticipated, and it had endured. But as I stood there, looking out across the waters that bordered the city, the journey that had brought me to that point settled into place not as a completed story, but as a beginning, because the forces I had encountered, the patterns I had followed, the threats I had faced, all pointed towards something beyond the pact, something that reached across Tamriel itself. The war was not over. It had barely begun, and whatever came next would not be contained by any one alliance. But for now, the rift held, and with it, the Ebonheart Pact endured.